Microsoft and Google and Facebook and Apple were also very intentional at one point going into these markets. The issue with somebody like Microsoft or Google, they've been in the market for 20 years or so, and so they're no longer intentional. As far as they're concerned, they have this check mark, we ship to this market, we've done the work to support it, but they're no longer intentional. And you can see that with the quality of the product, with the robustness of the design. As their design changed, the fundamental technologies kind of stayed behind in terms of internationalization and BiDi. So I think being intentional is such a fundamental quality to have when you go into a new market if you want to be successful.
Gilad, finally, again.
Yeah.
Round 2.
Version 2.0. SP1.
Let's go. Welcome to the podcast, first of all.
Right. Thank you. Great to be here.
How are you doing, Lai?
I'm doing great. Not too bad.
You have a special time in a month, right? When it comes to
Yeah. And we'll get back into that probably later.
Yeah, maybe we can talk about it later. So where exactly are you right now?
I'm in a small town in North Israel, not too far from Haifa. Haifa is the big city. A small town called Kiryat Tivon, about 15,000 people.
Is that your hometown?
Yeah, same town. I was born there. I actually live in the same house that I'm 42 now, so back to my childhood home. Yeah.
I remember when we were doing the recording for the first time, you were a little bit mysterious about your age.
Really?
Yeah, I was just listening to the recording and before we started doing this, and I think you were saying like, okay, now if you tell me about the BiDi issues when you first noticed them, then we will guess how old you are.
Yeah, exactly. Because I think you were asking about when was the first time you saw BiDi issues, and then I said, wow, you're gonna find out very quickly. I when I first saw a computer, it was running DOS. So
yeah, okay, but you didn't get into localization in Israel, right?
No. I actually moved to the States when I was young. And I think when I was around 20, a friend of mine said, I was going through college and a friend of mine said, hey, Microsoft is looking for Hebrew native speakers to test out the latest version of Windows that's coming out, which was Windows ME. And he said, it might be a fun gig. They don't pay a lot. It was like $15 an hour or something, but you might enjoy it. And I had plans. Like I thought, hey, I'll just work at this gig for about 6 months or so, save enough money to go to India. And that was my expectation. Ended up being about 20 years in the company, So,
why did you want to go to India?
I don't know. I just, it was one of those things where maybe I was spiritually connected to India or something. Just, something there was, the adventure.
Was it supposed to be your first time to visit India? Or?
Yeah. No, I actually haven't been there at all. So I never got to go to India, never got to it. But it was just one of those things when when I was 20 and I wanted to be adventurous, I said I'd go to India or something, right? So that was the motivation. There was nothing behind it. But yeah, I ended up taking a rather long trip at Microsoft, which was just as entertaining, I think.
What made you stay at Microsoft for so long? Like, how do you remember your first work experience with them when you didn't think about the job very seriously?
I always thought about the job very seriously, but I think I don't know what the drive behind the job was. I initially started as quality assurance, right? And I think very quickly people realized, they offered me a full-time position within less than a year because my work was very good. BiDi tends to be a lot more buggier, but it also requires that the person looking at it has a very deep understanding of what's going on, But I think very quickly they realized that, you can't have me just doing quality assurance. Because the issue I would find, a lot of the issues were design changes. And so having design changes come at a very late stage is a very big problem. And so very quickly, I kept the quality assurance title for quite a while, maybe like 12 or 13 years. But my job was nowhere close to quality assurance. I was basically free to do whatever I wanted in terms of impact on the product and vision. And so the title really wasn't anything that drove me ever. The team, the title, it was never an issue, right? Like it was never something that I felt bound by. So I was always trailblazing, if you will.
When you had this freedom, was it related only to Hebrew, or was it about internationalization and BiDi languages in general?
I think the fact that I was so good at what I did for Hebrew and Arabic and BiDi in particular allowed me to venture to other areas as well. Sometimes the issues come out with the BiDi languages a lot more clear than they would on other languages. And so when you're able to take a issue you found on BiDi and say, wow, but if you think about some of the other locales, they're going to get impacted by this, then quickly you start not just thinking about BiDi, but just thinking about the larger picture of internationalization. Some of the issues are design changes, some of the issues are technical issues, but a lot of, I think, the internationalization work is being able to project a vision forward for a product. And that takes very special people, right? It's not everybody can do that. And I think I was very good at it. And I enjoyed it, and I had the total freedom. And some managers loved my freedom, and some managers didn't know what to do with it. Because I'll give you an example. For many years, my impact was with, design changes and bugs and making sure that we're shipping something that's relevant to the market, the BiDi market, or internationalization in general. But take a manager that's being pressured to have their team produce automation. I mean, it doesn't make a lot of sense for somebody like me to sit there and write automation when I'm making significant changes to the product, design changes, And so for me, it was always a struggle to do the bare minimum to keep the managers happy with the formal title, and then make sure that I'm driving innovation across the product and challenging myself. I'm always here for that challenge.
When you talked about fixing or improving the experience for BiDi and how it affects the other languages, are we talking about, let's say, fixing the root cause, which would have an impact on the source English product?
Yeah. Even sometimes you're able to, some of the best design changes basically reduce bottlenecks. You want to produce a robust enough design that can handle all these different variations of locales and localization or whatever. But if the design is robust enough, the user experience is great, right? Both for the user, both for the developer developing on that platform. It's a win-win situation. So I guess being somebody like me, my best qualities is being able to reduce these bottlenecks and make the design, or at least the people working on the design, think that they have to produce something that's robust enough so that down the road, or they have something that's sustainable, that works, that makes sense, and not some patch.
When we're talking about robustness, this may be a stupid question, but do we always want to have just one source and one design for all the languages? Or have you come across any examples where you might have a different source for BiDi languages?
Well, I don't think so, but I'll give you an example, okay? So one of my first ideas when I came to Microsoft as a full-time employee, and during my interview, I said, I have an idea. This was 20 years ago. This is like 2000, I think, or 1999. And I said, we need to have gender-based localization. So the UI strings are basically translated for the user, female form and masculine, feminine form. Okay, but not on the same UI. So basically, if you're a male, you can select Hebrew male version, or If you're a female, you can select if you choose Hebrew female version. And I think that solved a huge problem because, the machines today, even today, they refer that in some languages you just can't work around the gender issue when it comes to localization. And so the translation often refers to in masculine form. That's not very inclusive. And so I think today with the technology of machine translation, we can actually take the Hebrew source and do the analysis and application of masculine to feminine form rather easily and rather cost effective in terms of resources. But you know what's stopping us from doing that? So like the resource loader on Windows won't allow you to have more than one version of Hebrew. So you're never going to be able to put this other version in there. So that's one example where the design isn't robust enough. You're not able to do two versions of Hebrew, two versions of Arabic. By the way, when I brought up the idea, one of the locales I thought was great was the Japanese locale, because the Japanese market thought, wow, we can create a version of Japanese for children. Because they're having a hard time reading the UI because they're not at that level yet. And we could use a second version of Japanese so that if you're, 7 to 9 years old, you get a version that you can read. And so that just goes to show that, one thing that came from, thinking about gender inclusiveness for Hebrew and Arabic quickly turns into age inclusiveness for Japanese. And you just can't do that today with Windows, for example, because they're not able to have two versions of the same language loaded.
So what happened to that idea?
The funny story was I came to I think it was like the director level manager that hired me into Microsoft. And he was a great guy. I'm still in touch with him today. Bjorn Redding, I think he's a VP of internationalization at Facebook. And he is actually the guy that invented MUI, the resource loading technology that allows the localization to be separate from the code. And I came to him and I said, Bjorn, I have this great idea for gender-based localization. And this is 1999. People are still using the same profile at home. They have one computer. It's not like today, your phone and your Facebook and whatever. And he laughed and he said, well, me and my wife, he's German. He said, me and my wife, we use the same profile. And so you want the machine to refer to me in feminine form? I don't think that's a good idea. And I laughed and I said, he was a great guy. It was all a good conversation. I said, Bjorn, you don't understand me. You're not a woman. And he looked at me and he's like, you want to talk to my skip level? And his skip level was Lori Brunel, and I had a chat with her. In general, I think they thought it was a good idea, but I think at the time they just couldn't allocate the resources to have the resource loader modified to have the idea come through. So I think 20 years later, same issue for Windows at least. Maybe for Facebook, where that's not an issue, they can have another version of the language.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but so that idea today, I'm actually pushing that idea as part of my work as the chairman of the Hebrew Support Committee in Computer Systems at the Standard Institute of Israel. We are looking to push that idea forward in one way or another.
Where would you push this?
Wow. Ideally, we'll start with a local standard. And then hopefully roll it up to W3C or Unicode. I'm not sure what the challenge is there, what kind of challenges we're facing when we approach those standardization bodies. So it's not my top priority as the chairman, but it's certainly a work item that I'd love to see happen. It has impact, by the way, on a lot of things. It's not just being able to localize for Hebrew and Arabic in a more inclusive way. It also, I think, has impact on other things like machine translation that learns off existing resources, or text prediction and spell checking. all kind of feed off existing strings and existing language out there. So the minute you make the language more inclusive, the better those technologies are going to be in terms of accuracy.
So let's go back to when you were young, before you joined Microsoft. And let's repeat the question that you already spoiled, what we discussed last time. So as a user, before you started working in the industry, have you noticed any issues like that, or is it only after you joined Microsoft?
I think because of the years that I started, DOS didn't have a UI, so that wasn't an issue. And then just interoperability those days just didn't exist. Unicode came into play many years later. So I didn't really pay attention to those issues because software wasn't even available in most cases in languages like Hebrew and Arabic. Let alone an input experience of any kind. And so I think it was only Windows 95 or 98 when Microsoft finally released a Hebrew and Arabic version of Windows. And I might have gotten a glimpse of that, but just to put things in perspective, Windows, I think 98 came 2.5 years. I mean, the Hebrew version of Windows 98 came probably 2 years after the original release, just to show you how difficult the release process was at those years. And so I wasn't exposed to those things very much before I started working for Microsoft. But the one thing about going into Microsoft and starting to work on Hebrew and Arabic version almost immediately, because it's a pre-release build, I mean, the issues are so clear. Right? Like you're seeing UI mirroring bugs and text layout bugs, and those were probably the two biggest bug categories. Those are very easy to spot for the trained eye.
So yeah, let's talk about the issues in a bit more detail, and maybe you can also compare it to the situation right now.
Right.
Let's start with software.
Software, right. And Windows in particular, I mean, any software, but I think the two biggest challenges for anybody going into this market is UI layout, UI design, because the Hebrew and Arabic markets require that the UI layout is repositioned so it flows from right to left. And that's a significant amount of resources that have to be invested in making sure that happens correctly. It's not a switch you flip and everything just magically happens. And that, and we'll talk about later about probably how engineering systems and design systems today just don't do that well. And so for a developer, it's not about switching something and making sure that the UI layout is working correctly. There's a lot of thought that goes into it. Imagine it's not just the UI, it's the experience, right? You have a lot of things that you have to take into consideration when you reposition the UI to flow from right to left. Because not everything flows purely from right to left. And take, for example, a media control. If you have a multimedia player, the play button, the back and forward buttons, next track, forward track buttons are actually left to right oriented. What happened is the markets received, tape and cassette players and CD players from, that were just manufactured probably in China, and that's what they received. So they were used to seeing the play button flow from left to right. They're used to having the track controls flow from left to right. And they also want to see the progress bar on something like that flow from left to right. And so if a developer approaches a media player that's built for English and it just says mirror this, all of a sudden everything flows from right to left. It might look okay, but it might just, the user is not going to like it. And so there's a lot of thought that has to go into what makes sense there in terms of mirroring the UI. There's also a lot of back-end work that has to do with content. So imagine if you have like a swipe control for flipping between pages on a book. Okay, so usually if you're flipping a page on a book, like a PDF reader, where the pages are spread horizontally, then you'd flip from right to left to go to the next page on English, right? And so for Hebrew, you have to go, if you'd think that in Hebrew, you'd have to go from left to right to go forward. And so if we want to circle back to robust design, it's not about hard coding the direction, because you never know what kind of book you're going to open. So imagine having a UI that's English and you open a Hebrew book. And now you want to be smart enough to understand what the content is and then make your UX interaction adjust appropriately. That's robust design. That's perfect. That's natural. I think I actually have a patent pending application on that particular. I do. I did apply for a patent for it. We had exactly that. We had a PDF reader that had the function of being able to swipe to flip the page on Windows, and I wanted the design to be robust enough to allow both directions based on the content. But it's really hard to understand what the content of a document is today in terms of language. Like, how do you know what the language of the document is and then adjust the layout appropriately? And so do you have a good solution for that? How would you do it?
I think when I was working at Moravia, also my early days, a long time ago, I know that one of my team members, an LE, localization engineer, once we were doing a delivery for Microsoft, by the way, because I started working for Microsoft. Right. Windows, by the way, as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And he swapped, due to file management inconsistency, he swapped Chinese simplified and Chinese traditional. Mm-hmm. So of course the files. So of course it was a big mistake, and then we were asking our R&D department to come up with some way to check what language the files are. And you're basically trying to locate the unique characters that are only applicable to a certain language. But I'm not sure about Hebrew. Do you have any specific characters or something that's only used for Hebrew?
Yeah, you could probably look at the Unicode range and say this is it, but that isn't going to be 100% bulletproof, right?
Because sometimes you don't have those characters.
You might, you might have a mixed document with English and Hebrew, and you never know. But the user knows when you open the document what language the document is in, right? Like if you just stare at it for a second, you know what language it is.
But when you said mixed English and Hebrew, how would it look like? Like there's only pieces of English in a otherwise completely Hebrew text, or some parts of it could be English and Hebrew?
Imagine a technical document where you have a Hebrew technical document with a lot of English. How do you, what percentage of measurement do you have to make sure it's a Hebrew or English document, right? It's a very tricky question. Mm-hmm. More so on content on the internet, for example. My solution was very, very simple. It wasn't about that. I didn't want to go scan the document at all. I thought the user knew exactly what document they're looking at. And guess what? The initial swipe direction is the direction of the document. So the minute the user swipes, you know which direction the document has to flow. And so that's I have a patent pending application. I don't know if it went through or they canceled it, but that was my basically patent pending moment, if you will, to make sure designers are robust enough. Mm-hmm. So that's about robust design and user experience and UI layout and directionality in UI layout. The second biggest issue with BiDi in particular is text interaction.
Yeah, before we get into that, I'm wondering, when we're talking about the design, you were saying that some of the controls, they need to stay in a place. So it's not like revert or flip everything globally. So how are these exceptions handled? Like, can you, in the design software, you can set some controls stay like this all the time and flip these?
I haven't seen a design system to date. Like I recently looked at Adobe. Adobe has a design product. I forget what it's called. And there was internationalization features like pseudo localization, which was really interesting, but there's nothing about mirroring UI. A lot of the knowledge today about which controls get mirrored is out there. Like I wrote a very robust set of guidelines on how to mirror certain UI elements, and but the design systems don't take that into account because they just don't look at BiDi in particular. So it's not like you're able to take your design in any design system and just flip it. And for the design system to be robust enough and smart enough to say, if you have an on-off button that's horizontal, you should probably mirror it. The design system isn't smart enough to say this particular control has to be mirrored. It's also, the design system isn't smart enough to say, if you're mirroring media control, don't mirror the play button and the back and forward track controls. There's nothing out there that actually does that. Not a design system, not an engineering system. There's like it's missing the artificial intelligence to help developers and designers avoid the mistakes, right? It's a blank canvas. And so I think that's one of the biggest steps that the industry has to do with internationalization in general, not just BiDi. BiDi is great, but imagine if you had a design system that's robust enough to help the designers and developers actually jump into a localization project and not be in a position where they're exposed to making some of the inherent errors because they're not aware and the design system didn't prevent them from doing that. So we just don't have that today. That tool isn't available in the industry. And then again, the internationalization knowledge isn't being, in many companies, and at least the big ones, isn't being spread effectively enough to make sure that we don't do these mistakes, right? If I look at Facebook or Google or Microsoft or Apple today, they all have mistakes that they ship with, bugs. And so I think it's just a reflection of their engineering system and design system that isn't able to help them produce experience that's a lot more, a lot better with lower overhead.
I still don't understand it, and maybe you can explain it by telling us how the mirroring technology works. But what I still don't understand is, let's say, okay, I'm a developer, I create something, I don't know anything about BiDi, so I'll just flip everything because I read it on the internet, and then I send it for QA, and the QA person like you tells me, okay, this is good, you flip this, but these individual controls here need to be as they are in English. So how would he do it? How can he set it?
I don't come from a developer background, but my understanding of what developers do is they flip a switch, basically, that says mirror everything. The issue with that switch is that everything that's inherent there, all the other elements mirror with that. So what happens is a developer, and that's why that's why people don't want to go into the BiDi markets, because the developer has to sit there, do the initial mirroring, which basically mirrors everything, and then all the elements that have to get unmirrored, you actually have to manually go through them and unmirror them. And so the two issues there are, one, the technology is kind of like a bucket of cold water, right? You just you just sit there and you douse somebody with it, right? And then you go in and you have to do all this tedious work and hope that you did it correctly, because not a lot of companies have BiDi experts, right? And one of the easiest things for most languages is, go ask the native speaker. But with the BiDi languages, you can't do that, because you really have to have somebody who understands user experience to help you understand how to mirror or unmirror things, right? So it's not as easy as asking hey, Hebrew speaker, if you have one in the office, can you tell me if this is mirrored correctly? You get three types of people. The first one's going to tell you it's mirrored correctly. The second one is going to tell you it's mirrored incorrectly. And the third one's the worst. You know what the third one is? he's the one that hates the mirrored UI. And he's like, why do you guys even go through this painstaking process of doing this, right? You should just use English. And so
I thought that the third guy was, it's bad, but this is what you need to fix in the design phase.
No, it's the other, the worst kind, the one that hates the mirrored UI and just says, yeah, you should just not do that.
But was there so far I got the impression that it's all up to the poor developer to fix this, but was there ever any initiative to move this work to the vendors who are the ones working on localization? Was there anything like this possible in Loc Studio?
I think maybe in the past they had some power to do that. I hope they've stopped doing that because, just having a robust system means that you're doing this through the code and not through the localization layer, because that's buggy. I mean, imagine, the localizer, does that incorrectly, and then you're trying to figure out whether the code is introducing the issue or the localizer is introducing the issue. And that was a lot of the work for the localizers at Microsoft to understand whether or not the UI mirroring issue was introduced from the localization process or from the code. And so when the system got really robust, probably 90+% of the mirroring issues were code issues, and the localization team was just focused on, localizing strings. I think the better approach also is to have the feature team that's working on a particular UI own the UI mirroring, because they have to also own the experience, right? They have to have this end-to-end design, develop, localize experience. During my time at Microsoft, at least at the end of my tenure as an internationalization expert, we were doing design walkthroughs that basically looked at the design phase of things, and I would take mock-ups in PowerPoint and give them back as mirrored, so that the design team understands exactly what has to happen. The developer has a very good blueprint of what work they have to do. And so that was Microsoft. I don't think they do that today, by the way. I think the reports I published are an indicator that isn't happening anymore. But when it was working very, very well, because it did a few things. It helped educate people inside the company. They didn't have to become expert, but they had access to an expert. They were learning. And then, as time went by, 2-3 years into it, they were able to do a lot of these things on their own and only ask me the really complicated questions, right? And so I think when you're able to integrate internationalization into the process, that's a very basic step. So if the entire design process has an internationalization expert there, you're going to save a lot of time and resources. You're going to make the release more predictable. You're going to have your bug counts lower. And that worked really, really well. And more so if you have a tool set and an engineering system that prevents people from doing what we call this low-hanging mistakes, or the low-hanging fruit, the stupid mistakes. And that doesn't exist today. Just no one has something that works that well.
Why do you think the things went south?
For what? For Microsoft, just in general?
For Microsoft or in general?
I think just in general, you can look at a few companies and say they decided to go internationally and they did very, very well. So I'll give you an example. Spotify not recently, but about a year ago, came into Israel. And I mean, what a delight. They did an awesome job. I'm not about criticizing companies. I want them to kind of think about what they do, and I want to empower them. I want to motivate them. I want them to do things better. So, you can look at my reports and say, he's sour or something, but it's really not the case. I love Microsoft and I love people there, and I want them to do better, right? I want to motivate them. I want to empower them. And if you read my reports, you can see what the expected behavior should be, so they can just take those reports and fix everything, right? But when, I'll give you the example of Spotify coming into the market. Here's, I think one of the things that companies do is when they decide to go into a market, they're intentionally going there. Being intentional is so important. And Spotify nailed it because they were intentional about coming to Israel. They performed UI mirroring with very few issues. They did the text handling inside the application with very few issues. And it's just a delight to get something like that. I thought they did a wonderful job because they were intentional. They were very focused on coming into the market and doing something very, very well. And I think Microsoft and Google and Facebook and Apple were also very intentional at one point going into these markets. The issue with somebody like Microsoft or Google, they've been in the market for 20 years or so. And so they're no longer intentional. As far as they're concerned, they have this check mark, we ship to this market. We've done the work to support it, but they're no longer intentional. And you can see that with the quality of the product, with the robustness of the design. As their design changed, the fundamental technologies kind of stayed behind in terms of internationalization and BiDi. So I think being intentional is such a fundamental quality to have when you go into a new market if you want to be successful. And Spotify does that very well. And most recently, I think also Netflix did a very good job. And that's what we see the last few years are this, the Netflix chart of new users. And, it's a beautiful chart. It's look at all the growth and all the happy people you have because you're intentional about going into a market with local content and great experience. And so you have to be intentional.
I totally get it that when a company is introducing or entering a new market, they want to have the best experience for the users to make the first impression great. Mm-hmm. But in the case of Microsoft, was there no feedback from the user base, or doesn't it reflect in the number of users or the number of sales?
Yeah, if you look at Microsoft as an example, and I'm sure other companies are struggling with the same issues, like a lot of these companies have feedback mechanisms, okay? So some of the feedback mechanisms are just telemetry, right? Nobody's not a user behind them, but we just get a telemetry reading from the machine that's, says machine is happy, machine is not happy, driver's working, driver's not working, things like that, right? That's one thing. But when it comes to user feedback on design, it's a multi-dimensional problem. So take a market like Israel, right? It's a very demanding market in terms of the resources that need to be allocated to get into the market because of the UI mirroring and text support. And but Microsoft, for example, with the Insiders program, has a huge bucket of feedback. Israel is 9 million people on a good day when everybody switches on their computers. Even if they decided to have a crowdsourcing sponsored event with everybody sending feedback, you get 9 million. How does that compare to the Chinese market, right? Where you're dealing with a few billion people. And then you might have some program manager sitting there saying, hey, you have this small market complaining about an issue compared to the Chinese market complaining about an issue. I think it comes to the point where they're not able to scale the feedback program to be locally relevant. And that makes people very, very frustrated because they feel like they're getting a reduced experience. They feel like a second-class citizen. They don't feel included, It's all about inclusiveness and being able to inclusively add user feedback regardless of market so that they feel like somebody's tailoring the product for them. And so I think with big companies like Microsoft, the feedback from smaller markets it just gets drowned, right? And then you have the language barrier and other things, right? So that's one aspect, one dimension of the user feedback issue when it comes to international markets in general. The second thing is I think that a lot of these companies have unconscious cultural bias when it comes to international feedback. And I say that in a way of they need to be cognizant of that issue. So I think some people will have an easier time prioritizing a piece of feedback that comes from the market that they're in at that moment. So if you're sitting in Palo Alto and you get a piece of feedback from the United States compared to a piece of feedback from, let's say, Dubai, you're probably going to treat the piece of feedback from Palo Alto, United States, more than you would the piece of feedback from far away. And so...
Is there no country office in Israel that would be pushing this?
So for all of the multinationals, Israel is a high-tech nation, right? It's the startup nation. There are plenty of R&D centers here. But the Israeli R&D center, for example, for Microsoft, doesn't deal with the Hebrew version of Windows at all. That isn't they do cybersecurity, they do artificial intelligence. That's why this market is so strong in terms of startups. That's what they do. And so it's not about that because, and Microsoft isn't, for example, I've talked to the folks at the Windows Insiders program and I said, you really have to make a local version of the Insiders program, not to say that you have to develop features that are specific to the market, but you want to have people running the feedback program in their native language inside the market. Like one of the things that isn't inclusive about the Windows Insiders program is they're never going to be able to have the podcast that they do, the live podcast, on a schedule that meets everybody's needs, right? Like you're going to do it like 11 a.m. Pacific time. Somebody in Israel is going to be sitting there at 1 a.m. in the morning going, I don't want to listen to this. And then they're not even going to listen to the local feedback, right? Then you're back at this huge bucket where you're competing for attention. And that's just depressing, right? And so I think there's a lot of things. The multidimensional issue is with that, right? Being inclusive of people is that. The other thing is that I've noticed with certain companies is that, let's say you had some UI clipping on the English version of a feature that you're releasing, right? You'd never release that with that kind of bug. Like let's say it was some major clipping, right? You'd go and fix that. Well, here's where that unconscious cultural bias comes in for international design and localization. The feature team will say, let's see if the customer complains about it.
Mm-hmm.
And then your quality bar, you have two standards basically. You have the English standard quality bar, which is the top of the notch. And then you have this, we'll wait to see if they complain about it. And then the user doesn't want to go that route. They're not going to complain about something that's broken. They're not your quality assurance team. They're having a horrible experience. They're not going to reach out. They might not even use your product down the road, And so I don't think people that have this unconscious cultural bias are cognizant of that approach, right? They do it unconsciously. That's why I'm not angry about it. I think it's an issue that just has to be aired. And that's something that I had to, when I was working at Microsoft, it was one of the things that I'd fight for bugs. I'd fight for bugs till the day like that thing was kicked out the door, right? It would drive people crazy. But what I was actually fighting wasn't the technology, it wasn't that, it was the bias, right? Like I don't want my customers to complain about this. This has to go out the door just like it would for English, without this clipping or without this horrible bug. And so you could see that today.
You were talking about Spotify and how well of a job they did, but you still mentioned that you noticed some small issues. I'm just curious, what are those?
Just certain text, when you have, first of all, they did UI mirroring very, very well with no issues, which is almost unheard of. I mean, even if you go to settings and stuff, everything is done very, very well. And so kudos for that. The issue with any application that displays content, and you never know what the content is going to be, is that you have to be smart about displaying that content correctly. And so there's technology. Most of the major platforms today will detect whether or not you're displaying content in BiDi or not, and then make certain adjustments like layout and alignment so that the content flows so that the text flows correctly. And so Spotify has just minor issues where sometimes the text isn't aligned correctly when it comes to like showing I think it was like the artist bio, I think, or something like that. They're welcome to reach out. I'll point it out. More than happy to. But it's really minor because it's a very small fix, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And so those are the issues where developers, even if they nail UI mirroring, BiDi is very unique because now you have to have text handling where you don't have to do that for other languages. The text sometimes has to flow from right to left, sometimes have to flow from left to right. And that's why we talk about robust design. Even on English UI, you might have to display Hebrew text from right to left, laid out and aligned from right to left. And so having a robust design that's able to handle that correctly is priceless.
Mm-hmm.
Because it creates a great user experience. And by the way, today nobody does that very well, by the way, today. So the technologies that are doing that kind of adjustment are very, very old.
Mm-hmm. So does it mean that when I search for Hebrew artist on Spotify using my English UI, it will show right to left?
I don't know. It might. I don't know how. This is about a rich internationalization experience. Like, imagine you're in Vancouver. Imagine like searching for a Israeli artist and then having that bio come up. What's the expectation? Like if Spotify is like done things very well, they know that you want to see things in English, so they'll show you the English bio of that artist. I'm in Israel and my UI language is Hebrew. They might show me the Hebrew version of the bio. Even if I search for like the Rolling Stones on Spotify in Hebrew, maybe they have a machine translated bio that's in Hebrew and they can display that, right? Because it's more about like you don't know if the user is multilingual, right? And so you want to be able to tailor the experience to the best of your ability to make sure that it stays in the right language. So I don't know how they do it, but it wouldn't make a lot of sense for them to have you read a Hebrew bio if you don't know Hebrew.
Right. Yeah, makes sense.
Right.
And so the second thing when it comes to software BiDi issues that you wanted to talk about was text input.
Well, text user experience in general, whether it's displaying text. We just talked about being able to align content automatically. That's a technology that's 20 years old. You know how they do that, by the way? In most tech stacks, whether it's Google, Microsoft, Facebook, whatever, they try and sample the first few characters of a string, and then if it's a BiDi string like Hebrew or Arabic, then they'll apply the right properties for the alignment and layout. Okay, and so that can go horribly wrong because you could have a English string that starts with a Hebrew word. Like if I said Haifa and Tel Aviv are city names in Hebrew, and Haifa and Tel Aviv were spelled in Hebrew, and that's the beginning of the sentence, then the rendering engine would think that's a Hebrew string and align it from right to left, and then you get a reading order issue. Like the strings go all over the place, and that's where you introduced errors. And that's why, one of the things for me in the Standard Institute of Israel is to push these technology companies, the platform companies, to start reinvesting in technologies to make this experience a lot better, because what we're seeing today is 20 years old. That's 20-year-old solution. Imagine how many technology leaps we've done to make that experience better. And imagine if you're able to have the machine be smart enough, the platform smart enough to understand language and detect language. That has impact for other locales, not just BiDi. And imagine what you can do with that. I mean, so you really want to get to the position where you understand the string. If you're displaying a string, what is the language that string is written in, so that you can make all kinds of other great experiences. And so for us, that's a huge thing, right? Because like when it gets wrong, and it often when it's often wrong, the experience is horrible. Like imagine having a full sentence aligned incorrectly, and every time you try to get to the beginning of the line, it's basically all over the place, right? Because it's not even.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a very poor experience. And then on top of that, when it comes to the text input experience and text selection experience, all of that is today on every major platform influenced by directionality of the string. So I'd love to, maybe we can integrate into this podcast a video demo of how bad text selection is on Hebrew and Arabic under certain situations so people can visualize it. You really have situations that aren't they're not corner cases where the user will try and select text. And, in English, when you select text from left to right, right to left, whatever, it's a continuous motion. There's no breaking points, right? There's no spaces that are unselected in the middle. Well, in certain situations, when you have like a mixed language strings in Hebrew and English, and you start selecting, at one point, the selection becomes unlinked. You actually have a big chunk of text that isn't selected in the middle, and the selection process is kind of flipped around and reversed, and then goes in the other direction, and then flips back to the original direction. And that has to do with the fact that all of these technologies are based on the Unicode BiDi algorithm. That's the Unicode consortium, the big standardization body. And the BiDi algorithm there, it's a very smart algorithm, but it's 20 years old. And one of the issues with it is that it's not backed by usability studies, right? And so one of my biggest pushes in the Standard Institute of Israel right now is for every standard that we push, and one of them is text interaction, is to have robust usability studies so that we can back up our research and standardization efforts with real user data and not just expert assumptions, right? Because I'm an expert, but I'm sure that I'm going to learn some new things about how people use computers, right? And this is one of those prime things where I have to have the data so that I can go to Unicode with my standard and say, not only is the standard, it passed rigorous standardization requirements in Israel, and it has a bunch of subject matter experts behind it. It also has, here are the usability results, right? Like here they are. We actually, one of the other things I did is bring into the committee experts I have a PhD candidate that is doing a PhD on UI mirroring and how that impacts the ability of a user to understand the UI. Yulia Goldberg, remember that name. And she's also going to be responsible for helping us kind of shape the usability studies around our standardization efforts for UI layout and text interaction. And so we're very, very happy we have another expert. We're very happy to have these experts come in. We have another couple of experts coming in that are leaders in Israel for data visualization. There's no standard today that indicates whether or not a chart should flow from right to left or left to right. I've been in the business for 20 years. I can't tell you the answer for that, and here are these people that are in the market and they're experts, but it's very important for me to have them also back up their standardization efforts with usability studies. So for data visualization, for example, we have some crowdsourcing that was done for user research, and we found that the guy that did the research basically found that 70% of people prefer charts from left to right, and 30% of BiDi speakers prefer charts from right to left. And so, how do you create a standard that's robust enough to accommodate both of those? How do you make sure that you don't trump 30% of your users, right? Trump or trample. Sorry, my English is my second language, right? And so I think one of the initial ideas that we're going to bring into the usability studies is to mesh user experience with an UI layout for data with accessibility. And what if we had a indicator on the chart that would indicate to the user whether or not they should read the chart from left to right or right to left? And so that might be a possible solution where we integrate the best of all worlds to make reading charts more easier and more coherent.
So would the chart be just in one direction with an indication of how to read it?
Maybe it's a chart with one direction that with an indicator, like a little arrow that says, you should read this from left to right or whatever. Maybe if you wanted the design to be robust and people wanted to flip that, then you could click on that little arrow and it would flip it to right to left, and then they would remember your preference, but still kind of, indicate that, a chart reads from a certain direction. And those are exactly the things we're investing in terms of usability. And this is where companies that, produce these solutions aren't able to think about these things because they're not intentional about coming into this market and they're not aware of this issue.
Correct.
Right? So we're very focused, and we are very intentional about making sure that we spread the standardization so that it impacts design on the major platforms, right? And that's my other job, being able to reach out and take these standardization efforts and not keep them local. Make sure that they go to Unicode, make sure that they go to W3C, and so that we have a very robust set of standards that's actually internationally recognized.
Is Hebrew very different from Arabic when it comes to all these issues, or?
No. Just to give people a example of, first of all, there's I think 420 million BiDi speakers in the world. That's quite a large number, and I don't think most software developers understand that. There are differences between Hebrew and Arabic. Not a big deal. I think percent symbol positioning varies, so there's very little things that there's very small things. Not enough to say that this market is difficult because you have to tailor to every different locale, right? It's very few things that are different, and I think if you have a robust enough platform, most of these things are handled for you.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of UI layout, there's absolutely no differences. No differences. In terms of percent symbol positioning, and the Arabic question mark is flipped. But if you have a really robust platform, that's handled for you, right? And also Arabic uses native digits, which are, some platforms support that better than others.
Mm-hmm. Did you think about collaborating with someone from the Arabic countries?
Oh, yeah. Last time we talked was a few weeks ago. And now that we're talking, there's already 2 countries that signed a peace agreement with Israel. So the Middle East is already a better place.
Oh, nice.
And if there's anybody in the UAE or Bahrain that's watching this, and welcome to reach out. We'd love to chat. We've already put in a request through government. There's a government office for regional cooperation. We've already put a request to reach out to our counterparts in UAE. Frankly, I don't need that office to do that. If I knew who the people were, we could just start working. I don't need this official. That's never been my MO. I don't do the official. But I do have connections, for example, in Egypt, and we do have people from Jordan helping us with the Israeli standards. And when I was working at Microsoft, we worked with a variety of people from the Middle East. There's no reason that Israeli standards exclude Arabic from their standardization effort, and we actually were bringing in Arabic speakers to help us make sure that we're on par and take into account Arabic requirements. Because again, we want to be intentional about, Israel, 1/3 of the population are Arabic speakers. We want to be intentional about providing them an inclusive experience, a great experience. And so that's why we're making our standards more robust so that they include regional considerations. And the other motivation behind that is I want the Israeli standards to reflect regional requirements so that when I go to Unicode, I've already done that work. And so they're not going to, I don't know if Unicode or anybody else pushes back on me and says, did you make sure your neighbors are included? And I'll say yes, right? And so that's my motivation. That's why I'm intentional about doing these things so that they're very, very inclusive.
How can people participate in the usability studies? How are you planning to do it?
Yeah, we're going to shape. We don't have a solid plan on the usability studies yet. I think designing them is a very, very fine art and profession, and that's why we have. I have a limited experience with usability. I did market research at Microsoft, but I didn't do usability and design research. I think it takes a very professional set of people to go and make sure that happens correctly. Because you want to make sure that you are doing usability in a way that really looks at things from all different angles and not just the angle that you're trying to prove, right? And so I'm very good about that. And I have some very opinionated people on my committee that think that things should go in a certain direction. And I say, I want those same people to be the devil's advocate, right? Like, you want to look at things differently. And so I think it's going to be a set of usability studies that are done in a professional environment where we bring people in. We're fortunate in Israel to have both Hebrew speakers, Arabic speakers, and even Farsi speakers. So we're able to do this very inclusive look at usability studies. And I hope that we're also able to crowdsourcing through the internet so that anybody that wants to participate, we're going to be able to include them so that we have a larger sample set. It's about creating that large enough, the critical mass so that you have enough input. And so when the time comes, you can follow the committee's work on LinkedIn. We have a page there that I update, or you can follow me and I'll make sure to announce that we're doing that kind of usability study. And we'd love to have people, participate. All kinds of people, not just, that's the other thing. How do you get the right demographics? Not the computer geeks. How do you get the teachers? How do you get the information workers? How do you get the government employees? How do you get the people who work with these things day to day to participate in user research? That's a very big challenge.
Mm-hmm. Anything else that you want to cover when it comes to BiDi?
No, I think I think we've covered most of it. Yeah. I can tell you that I'm very passionate about BiDi. And I'm very good about asking people about their experience. And one of the things that drives me is to produce better experiences for people. I'll give you an example. My oldest daughter goes to elementary school, and the elementary school has an Office 365 subscription, and they wanted to do the annual reports, and they generated like a Word template. Somebody worked on the Word template very hard. It was a very, templates can be tricky, right? But when you have multiple people editing a template, then it becomes even more tricky. And when you have multiple people editing a document in BiDi, and the directionality of the text is so unintuitive in terms of the errors that the user can introduce, that becomes a nightmare. And my daughter's school actually had to pay they actually had to hire an external company to provide a Office 365 based solution for like $5,000 so that they're able to produce these reports. And that just goes to show you that being intentional about going into a market, maybe 20 years ago, this was acceptable experience, but today it's not. And so you have to be intentional, and you have to keep being intentional about supporting a market.
What was the problem with the templates? I don't get it. Is it like the text input or just the way you get the templates?
So when you're typing in Word, for example, or even Google Docs, there's a little control that says alignment, right? Like you can align the text in any direction. But in BiDi, it's more complicated because you also have to adjust the text layout so that the order of the words is correct. So you could have left aligned, right to left text. That's not a problem. You could have, so if you wanted to have right aligned English sentences, you can have that and they'll read correctly. But in BiDi, if you align the text and get the layout incorrectly, then you're going to have all kinds of characters just jump around, like the comma, the periods, the exclamation marks. And so people will sit there for hours trying to adjust the alignment and not the reading order, which is a different control. And that just goes to show you that the solution doesn't work anymore because it's not intuitive and the users just aren't aware of it. And it's not new. It's been there for 20 years, right? And so that's a really big issue because it just goes to show that nobody's intentional about having a good experience there.
So besides BiDi, clearly excited about, what are you curious about?
I'm curious about a lot of things. Most recently, I'm into the human design system, which is a system that allows a person to understand how their personality works. What are the mechanics of their personality? There's a few types in this. There's 5 types of personalities in this system, and a very detailed map that helps you understand what are the unique mechanics that you have in you, and how can you live in a more calibrated and precise way so that you feel that you're feeling good, that you're correct, that you're living your life the way you're supposed to on many levels, right? And so being able to look at that's one of the things where I found in the last few months, personal development. I thought for many years I was an alien. Seriously, man.
Really?
People just, people looked at me and said, what's going on here? What's this guy's all, how do you, very unique, right?
How did it manifest to be an alien? Like, did you not fit in anywhere?
I had living in the United States for 20 plus years, right? I always had a calling to come back to Israel. And so people around me would ask me why. You have a great job here. You're enjoying yourself. Life is good here. It's great. Why go back to Israel? And I always had a vision of going back to my house here in Israel that I returned 3 years ago. And turns out my design is very sensitive to its location and its community. And if I'm not in the right place, if I'm not eating the right food, if I'm not around the people that I feel are supposed to be around me, then I'm not in the right place, right? And so when I found that out, that all made sense. The other thing about my design is the only consistent thing about me is inconsistency.
Right.
And I think we've talked about that. Like, how do you handle that on the professional level, right? And so today when I do a lot of consulting work, how do you handle that on the consulting level? Because you have to deliver at a certain date, right? And so today I have a relief when I don't promise. I try not to promise to deliver on a certain date. Not because I don't want to, because there's other things that are driving me. And so I try to give myself a larger time frame to deliver on things so that I don't feel pressured and I don't feel miserable trying to accommodate for that, that deadline. And so that's the human design system that I'm in. And that's been probably the biggest pivot that I've done most recently in recent months.
I can imagine that when you were working at Microsoft, it was pretty much deadline driven, right?
No. I was true enough to my design while working at Microsoft. I have to sample things. I have to be having the need to sample things. I need a variety of things around me. So when the manager when my manager, one of the things where they would let me do what I need to do was really letting me live my design, and everybody around me thrived because, one day I'm working on tech stacks, other days I'm working on UI layout, another day I'm working on user locales or whatever, and another day I'm talking about design robustness, right? So every day is a different thing. So it's not that I'm shooting all over the place. I'm sampling and giving a reflection. I'm a reflector, by the way. I'm 1.3% of the human population, the rarest type of design there is. And so I'm reflecting to them what I think is the vision forward, not necessarily working on it, but allowing them to see things forward so that they're able to execute on it. And so when I have all these things together, I'm in heaven. Right? And so deadlines came and went. Some of my managers knew how to leverage my design to amplify. And that's the best thing you can do with somebody like me. And other ones wanted to condition me, which was the worst thing you can do. Because anybody who's being conditioned is going to be miserable. But anybody who's living their design is going to be very centered and very, very happy. And so I've had one manager that just knew that I don't think she was aware of human design, but she was very spiritual. And so working with her was great because she very quickly understood how my mechanics work and used that as the best tool you could, right? She used to send me out to understand the health of the organization, which is the highest level of what you can do with a reflector. Like, go and talk to everybody, because everybody can talk to you and not feel threatened, and help me understand what the health of the organization is, right? So I can make the proper adjustments so everybody's happy, And so that manager, by the way, was Anu Aurora, which now, she left Microsoft to become a coach, which is knowing her, like, amazing how people that are centered and correct about their lives can find the path that is very correct for them, very, integrated with their whole view of life.
Mm-hmm.
I'm so happy that she went that path and not, didn't stay in technology company, So that's one of the things I'm into.
But did you know about it before, or is it a recent thing?
No. After my divorce, I met my wonderful partner, and she started she's into these kind of things. And she signed up for the course. And, one of the things to check was, if you have a partner, what kind of type are they? And we dated for a year before that. And she looked at me and she said, in my statistics of knowing people, you're different. You're not, you're something about you. You're alien. I can't put my finger on it. And then, she said she opened the map. It was like, oh, now it all makes sense.
Right.
And so today, actually, I started, just today, I was in my first class. There's a 6 months course, I think it's 6 months, where I'm practicing living my design.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And so very excited to have that happen because I get to sample different people. I get to experience my design. I get to understand how other designs work. And it's a very interesting thing for me to happen.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing I do is I'm a paragliding instructor. I've been flying for 13 years. So on my free time, when I'm not advocating for the best BiDi experience in the world and more inclusive design and more being more intentional about going into international markets, is I jump off mountains and fly for miles and miles and miles, or kilometers. We're in the international business. It's an extreme sport, some say. I find it rather relaxing.
13 years. So you started in the US?
Yeah. I flew off. I used to fly a lot off Tiger Mountain in Seattle. That's where I learned. And so it's one of those things where, one thing about paragliding isn't I'm not an adrenaline junkie. It's very relaxing for me, but it kind of makes sense for me to have a sport like that, a wind-powered sport. Because with wind-power sport, just like the ocean, you never get the same day, ever. Like you never get a wave that repeats itself. You'll never get an identical wave to repeat itself, right? Whatever you fly that day or whatever you surf that day or whatever is never going to come back. That moment will never come back and never be the same. You'll develop some patterns, right? Like the air is more rowdy or the air is more calm, but you'll never get the same experience over and over again because every day is different. And being a design that needs to sample a lot of things, this is ultimate. This is never going to be boring for me because it's always different and I'm always sampling it a little bit differently. And so it's been one of those things where I'm able to take that, being an instructor and flying alone is one thing. Instructing people to fly off a mountain is a very different thing. And one of the things I learned from paragliding is how to manage risk versus reward. And one of the other things I did is I was able to take that into my work at Microsoft. How do you motivate people to take a risk, right? Some code has to get fixed. It's a risky thing. How do you change user experience? How do you position yourself so that I'm motivating them to jump off the mountain essentially. Now I have to motivate them and have them look at it in a way that they feel that the reward is worth the risk. And so a funny story about that is, I told you I used to fight for my bugs. When you have a milestone-based system, at a certain level when you reach the end of the milestones, they stop fixing bugs because they want to stabilize everything. And so only the toughest bugs get fixed or whatever, and some things you have to live with. And most people would back away. They say, oh, the bug bar is here now. I'm not going to talk about this bug anymore. That's one of the things that made me great at Microsoft and also got me into a lot of trouble because I'm so motivated about being able to produce that great experience that when the bug bar came and I knew there was a one-line code fix that can fix a bug, regardless of how minor or bad it was, I'd go and fight for it. And I'd go through the bug bars. And I'd go through, 2 days before we're shipping, I'm emailing the VP of engineering saying, hey, thanks for surprising us. Windows 10 was supposed to come out with the new, there's a way to clip text, right? Like you have the 3 dots, when you have a string that you clip. There's string clipping, it's called. So there's a way to do that with 3 dots. Well, they wanted to have a surprise and they decided to do like a fade effect. The design team thought a fade effect was great, and the developer went and did that fade effect. And he completely screwed it up for BiDi, so the leading edge of the string was faded away, so you can't even read it. And they're like, "Oh, we'll fix it down the road. It's not so bad." It's back to that unconscious cultural bias that we're talking about. And I said no. And they said, "Who are you?" Right? Like, who are you? I said, "Well, let's play, right? Like, let's put together." And I've gotten better over the years with it. I said, "Why don't we put together an email, director level email, so they can say yes or no, right?" And if the director said no, I'd go to the VP level and say, "This is unacceptable. We've never shipped something like this, and I don't care what the feature team says. We're not doing this." And the VP level would agree. And then I was laughing so hard one day because the VP, I had a bug that was escalated to the VP level, and the poor PM that was responsible for the feature was partying on a boat because we're at the end of the release, and he gets a phone call. And they're like, come back in, we have to fix this, right? And he's like, where did that come from, right? And so being able to take those risks, being able to motivate people to take those risks is something that I brought from extreme sports, from paragliding. And so that my secret weapon there was I had to motivate people sometimes and say, you know what? Do me a favor, just go and fix this. And I'll take you out for a flight. And, their eyes were like, oh. And so that was my secret weapon, and nobody knew about was how do you, I don't know what you call it. It's not it's not blackmail, right? It's the opposite. It's like, how do you incentivize
bribing people?
There you go. How do you bribe your developers to do stuff
How would you motivate me? Because I share with you that I have fear of heights. Mm-hmm. So I think the experience would be great if I overcame the initial fear. So how would you motivate me?
There's a few things you have to consider. First of all, the flight itself, if you're flying level, is very slow. You're doing about 15, 20 miles an hour. So it's kind of like riding a bicycle very quickly. There's no motor. And if you do the flight at the right hour, there's no turbulence, right? So the flight, for somebody like you, when I take people up, I make sure to feel whether or not, one of the questions I ask people is, if they say they're afraid of heights, only 3 to 5% of the world population is actually afraid of heights, where they step up on the ladder and become and have visual problems, right? Like they start seeing things, right? And if you don't have that issue, then you're not really scared of heights. Even when I stand, if you go up to the Space Needle in Seattle and look down below, you become scared, right? So it's more of a fear of falling and not the fear of heights. And if you have just the fear of falling, well, that's okay. You can overcome that. And so once you realize that, and if you have a good instructor, then you're able to have a calm flight. I would not do things to you. If you don't like roller coasters, if you're not the type that gets on a roller coaster because they like it, I'll have a very calm level flight with you so that you're able to have a great experience and you're able to feel that you've achieved something, even if you won't do it again ever. But you'll have that sense of accomplishment. And that's back to the risk versus reward. Your reward versus the risk, if you have the right person with you, is the reward is substantially better or bigger, and you're able to walk from that experience and then challenge yourself to do other things. And so that would be my motivational talk to you.
Thank you.
Right? Or anybody really.
Going back to localization, my notorious question: what do you think is wrong with our industry?
I think, actually, I know. I don't think, but localization is looked as the red-headed stepchild of everything of the development process. And it's a multi-dimensional problem, but I don't think you have the robust enough experience, whether it's design. You don't have the robust end-to-end engineering systems today to make localization inclusive enough so that you're able to produce software that goes internationally without a huge overhead. It's from the level of the research isn't inclusive in international markets. The design systems aren't robust and inclusive of design considerations for different markets. So basically, the developer experiences aren't robust and inclusive enough of international markets. And what happens is, so every one of those pivot points is left to struggle with the shortfallings of their design or design systems, right? Their systems. And so how do you scale internationalization so that it doesn't become this mouth to ear kind of, tribal knowledge, right? Like me and you know a lot about this, and if we sat together, we could talk about it for hours. But imagine the poor developer that has to sit there and figure things out, or the designer that's trying to figure things out. They're still relying on this tribal knowledge, and the technology hasn't been developed to have a robust enough end-to-end system that allows a designer to sit in front of the design system and have some kind of artificial intelligence to say, hey, you're going to mirror this for this locale. Here is what you should do, or here's how we've done this for you, and here's why. So that you're able to have a system that's smart enough to not only do things correctly so that people that don't have the knowledge are able to come into these locales with very little friction, but also to educate them as you do this kind of work, right? And today that's relying on people in the tribe, the internationalization tribe, the localization tribe, and that has to transition into a technology-based solution so that we're able to scale, so that we're able to not be seen as a tax. We're perceived many times as a tax. How many of our localization colleagues sit there and say, oh, the design team finally let me sit on the design sessions, but they said don't say anything. What? I've heard that multiple times from different companies. Like, the design team will let you sit in, but they won't let you comment so that you don't disrupt their design process. That's not being very inclusive, And so that's an issue. That's a culture issue. That's a technology issue. How do we stop becoming a tax, And more so in big platform companies and companies that are in it for the long haul, companies that are no longer intentional, companies that have people transition from role to role. How do you make sure that tribal knowledge transition into significant improvements in design and engineering systems so that people don't make mistakes? I think that's our biggest challenge. That and the unconscious cultural bias that has to do with the R&D process in many companies when it comes to international users, and I think that's a huge iceberg, And so those are the main things that concern me about the industry in general, because you're seeing more and more big companies shrink their localization teams because the technology is there to do machine translation or whatever. And if they think the localization team is just about translation, then they stopped innovating. That's when the innovation stopped, because they're no longer think about their international user. They just think, oh, we're just going to relabel everything and it should work. And that doesn't work. That's when innovation stopped. And that's a big concern.
I think this would be great final words from you. But just in case you want to end more positively, what would be your final words to the industry, the people listening?
Don't be afraid to be a trailblazer. Don't be afraid to challenge the status quo. Don't sit and think that the current standards in design systems and engineering systems aren't something that you can change. Like, don't be afraid to do it. I challenge them all the time. My next challenge is to challenge the Unicode BiDi algorithm that hasn't changed in 20 years. And that's a huge task. But when you talk to some people, they say, we comply with the standard. And I say the standard isn't good enough. And I think that's where I want. I want all you trailblazers. If you need your support, if you need my help, if you need your motivation, if you want somebody to reflect with you on what you can do to challenge, to be forward-looking, to make sure that our industry is robust and full of value for years to come. Don't be afraid. Find somebody like me. Find somebody like Andre that's sitting in front of me, and do it. Do it. I'll be more than happy to help.
Great. It's perfect. I have nothing more to add. Thank you. Thank you very much, Gilad. Looks like we finally made it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure. Thanks for having these podcasts. They mean a lot.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you. Awesome. Have a great day. Bye.
All right. Cheers. Bye.